What's up? And welcome. Video game clones have existed since, video games have existed. Making a video game is no easy task. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And once it is finally done, there is a chance that everybody thinks your game absolutely sucks. Which is exactly why so many studios over the years just copied the homework of other studios that already made a great game. The thing is, it does not always mean your game will have the same success as the game you are cloning. To quote Peter Parker's uncle, Uncle Spider-Man, with the ability to clone great games comes the responsibility to make your game fucking slap. That brings me to today's topic, God of War. God of War is a franchise still going strong today. My introduction to the series was God of War 2018. Now, I do like both God of War 2018 and Ragnarok. However, I prefer the old God of War games. These old God of War games absolutely slap, and there were a whole bunch of studios that wanted a slice of that sweet success. So, I decided to look at some of these God of War clones and see if any of them are actually any good. Conan, a game that did its very best to copy God of War and absolutely failed. So why is this game so bad? Let's start with probably the most important element of these types of games, the combat. The combat is sloppy, sluggish and very clunky. Attacks do not feel impactful. This is due to the terrible animations that this game has. When enemies are hit, the animations are not very expressive, making the impact feel weak. The animations of Conan are not much better either. They look very sloppy and basic, which not only contributes to the combat feeling and looking bad, but new attacks you unlock look very similar to all the other attacks, meaning that new attacks look as boring as the basic attacks you already have. I also need to mention some factors surrounding some of the moves in this game. The base heavy attack with the one-handed sword is slow, very slow. Like, look at this. Yeah, great job Conan, mail it to him, why don't you? A cool thing is that you can pick up the weapons of the enemies you have slain, meaning you can dual wield in this game, which is pretty freaking sweet. The significance of this point is that when you are dual wielding weapons, your heavy attacks are faster for some reason. It makes absolutely no sense. The circle button in this game will throw enemies, which is a cool idea, however the throw itself looks pathetic. There are also a bunch of new abilities you will unlock that just kind of suck. Some of them are just stupid, while others barely do more damage than the base attack it is meant to upgrade. The enemies are another problem. First off, they have some terrible AI. When you are fighting, it is common to see them just stand around till they suddenly decide to attack. Also, this is a game where enemies will constantly try and block every attack from the player, adding to the frustration with the combat. There are some enemies that have crazy attacks that can animation lock the player, which is very annoying. The enemies also only have like 3 attack movesets each, which combined with the very poor enemy variety makes fighting these enemies pretty boring and very repetitive. The boss fights in this game, they exist. Look, they are not the worst boss fights out there, and some have these extensive segments that could have been cool if it was not for all the issues with the combat. But the boss fights themselves aren't that fun to fight, due to them having very limited movesets as well, and there are some that attack in such quick succession that it gives the player little room to attack them, which can get very frustrating. You also have some magic attacks that might as well not even be there. The most annoying is probably the rage mode. For some reason they made it that the rage mode bar does not fill up over time when clearing out combat encounters. However, the rage bar fills up during the combat encounters. So you have to constantly attack and parry to fill up this bar, and if it fills up it will automatically activate, which is dumb as hell. Now when you get hit by an enemy, an amount of this bar will be lost, and if you have cleared up the combat encounter, the bar will start depleting. I'm not sure why they chose to make it this way or why they chose this approach, but it is very dumb. When it comes to the levels, they are pretty straightforward and very short, but they unfortunately are not even close to being as well designed as the levels of God of War. These levels do have some things you can find within them, the most common of which are half-naked women. I'm not kidding. These women give you XP, and you can also find some chests that also give you XP, and well, that's about it. That's all you can find in these levels. So what is my overall feeling towards Conan? Well, it's a game that is not good. It has a very simplistic combat system that will frustrate you most of the time. The levels were not good enough to keep me interested, and the game just has an overall sluggishness to it. Look, I can't say this is close to being the worst game I've ever played, but it's definitely a pretty bad game. Maybe a low ranking average game, but nothing more. Darksiders is probably the most well-known God of War clone and probably the best example of how to make a clone, as it is not just a one-to-one recreation of God of War, but actually has its own take on some of the elements. Now, the combat in this game is bloody good. The combat feels impactful and very smooth, and is greatly helped by the enemies, as this game gives you a bunch of enemies that all feel satisfying to fight, as they are properly designed and have a wide variety of movesets. This game also gives you a ton of moves, and all feel distinctively different from one another, have cool animations, and feel satisfying to pull off. This is a game that also has a bunch of very cool boss fights that manages to match the spectacle and awesome factor of the boss fights in God of War. In addition to all of this, there are some other factors this game gets right. Circle will kill the fragile weak enemies and will perform finishes on the regular enemies if their health is low enough. When performing finishes, you will receive souls, which is the currency of this game, but more importantly, you will also receive health. A lot of God of War clones do not give health to the player after performing finishes. The significance of this point is that it allows you to be more aggressive and encourages you to perform takedowns instead of just solely relying on health chests. You also have some cool abilities that do not just look cool but actually do a significant amount of damage or are otherwise just useful. You can also pick up some items in the environments and use them as weapons, or just throw it at the enemies. Finally, you have a secondary weapon that can be purchased, which can be used with your main weapon to create some epic combos. Now, there are some small issues I have with the combat. I say small because I don't believe they are that impactful towards the overall awesomeness of the combat system. First off, blocking in this game is weird. You have to stand still in order to block, and in all honesty, it might as well not have been in the game, as the dodge is perfect for creating distance from enemies and has combos that can close down distance and cause damage as well. The game also needs a bit more finishes. Not to say the finishes are bad, it's just I think it needs a little bit more. And finally, the lockdown button requires you to hold it down, which is just a little bit stupid. The game has some great levels, very similar to that of God of War, and like God of War have some great platforming sections as well. Yeah, there's not much more I have to say about Darksiders. This is a very good game, and there are many that would say this is probably better than God of War. So, in conclusion, if you haven't already given this game a try, maybe you should, because it's very good. Blades of Time. By all means, this could have been good. It could have been a good game, but they flubbed it. They messed it up. Yeah, despite the promising signs of this game, it is probably the worst game I've played for this video. Much like Darksiders, this is not a one-to-one clone of God of War, and has a bunch of unique elements to it. Now, the big issue is that this game has a lot of overall jank to it. The animations are the first big jank that I've noticed. Running animations, facial animations, and combat animations have an overall stiffness to them, similar to that of Conan, just a little bit worse. That being said, the combat is where the most potential lies. The game constantly gives you new enemies. You have a bunch of moves that you will unlock over the course of this game that's all cool and visually looks cool as well. And the game has some actual cool sections in the combat, like when you encounter an enemy with a magic shield that can only be broken by constantly shooting it, and then reversing time multiple times that creates multiple body doubles that will all shoot at the enemy to break its shield. These are all elements that a lot of games are missing out on, elements that can make a game actually good. So why exactly does this game suck? Well, like I said before, the game just feels janky overall, and the combat has that very same issue. The combat just doesn't feel impactful or satisfying in any way. Despite the game constantly giving you new enemies, they are all very similar to one another and only have one or two moves. Their enemies also love to spam these moves over and over again, which is very annoying and seems to be more like a design flaw rather than proper enemy design. You also have a gun in this game that just doesn't feel satisfying to use, and the game also has some boss fights that actually has potential to be great, but is yet again let down by the overall clunkiness of this game. Now, the level design is very basic and very boring at times, and there are a lot of times where you'll be backtracking in these levels, making them feel even more tedious. The game does, however, give the player a few simple puzzles and does try to change the levels up a little. For example, in the jungle level, there are sections where you slow down and you then have to use your order spell to make things go back to normal in order to fight the enemies. Again, the game is on the right track, but it is executed poorly, as most of these spells or abilities just kind of suck. And these sections where the game changes it up, well, they also kind of suck. Furthermore, the voice acting is not good at all. The game also made a baffling choice to make the main protagonist constantly talk. She is either dumping a bunch of lore onto the player or just going on about random bullshit. I have never seen or experienced anything like this in a game before, and it is just plain annoying. Now, this is certainly the worst game I played in this video, but it most definitely has a lot more potential. I genuinely believe they were on the right track with a lot of this game's elements, but sadly fell short and ended up delivering a pretty janky feeling game. Heavenly Sword is a game that almost certainly set out to be a one-to-one God of War clone and actually succeeded. Right from the first combat encounter, the combat feels way more satisfying compared to something like Conan. This game's combat adheres to the basics. Both enemies and player animations are well made. You have a wide variety of attacks. The enemies are well designed and properly function. And all of this comes together to create a satisfying feeling combat system. I also really like the fact that you have one weapon that has two other different attack modes, making up three distinctive attack styles. And I do prefer this approach as opposed to some secondary weapons that just are plain useless. Now, despite these factors, there are some negatives that do bring down the combat system just a little bit. Even though there are many different combos, none of them feel distinctive enough to stand out. The enemy variety is very poor. Even though this is a shorter game, it could have used with a little bit more enemies. The block button doesn't exist. Yeah, in this game the way you block is by not using any of the combat or action buttons, which was a little bit weird to me personally. And when it comes to parrying, well, the game completely lost me on that one, as the parrying system seems to be more reliant on luck rather than anything else. The game also throws a ton of enemies at you during every combat encounter, to the point where you would just be surrounded by a bunch of dudes, which is what I imagine it is like being a very attractive woman at an anime convention. The problem itself doesn't lie with the game throwing a bunch of enemies at you, rather with the fact that the enemies really like to block, maybe a little bit too much. Now yes, you do have different combat styles that can be used to break some enemy defenses, and you can also pick up small items and throw it at enemies that can also break their defenses. But despite these factors, the excessive blocking does disrupt the flow of the combat and makes it a little bit annoying at times. Another important factor I have to mention is the boss fights, as the boss fights in this game are just plain damage sponges, which causes them to just feel drawn out. A lot of these levels like to change it up with different gameplay sections. I do not mind it when games do this, but I do feel like some of these sections are just not good enough. The worst offender of these sections are the Kai sections, where you just shoot down enemies. The problem is that the shooting doesn't feel satisfying at all, and the controls are very stiff and kind of sticky. Now, despite the gameplay sections, there's still a lot to like about this game. The levels are decent. They are definitely not on the same level as Darksiders, but they are good enough. The story is pretty basic, but there are some great moments in the story. I do like Nariko, the main protagonist of the story. I think she's a pretty well written character with a decent backstory. I also love the villains in this game, who are all crazy and somewhat over the top. This is especially true for the main villain, King Bohan, who is voiced by Andy Serkis. And I must say that overall the performances in this game are very good, especially Nariko and King Bohan. Despite some of the issues I have with this game, I think this is still a good game and a little bit underrated. I would love to see a return to this franchise, and well, maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea, given that the studio Ninja Theory is owned by Xbox, and Xbox has been on a little bit of a downward spiral recently. So maybe pulling out a forgotten franchise like this might just be what they need. Dante's Inferno is not exactly a God of War clone, it's just kind of God of War. Now I must say that this game's opening few minutes manages to capture the same awesomeness as the God of War games, as you barely get to learn the combat mechanics and you are then immediately thrown into a boss fight with the Grim Reaper, and after you kick its ass, you steal the Grim Reaper Scythe, which is a pretty cool way to start your game. Now, for the most part, the combat is very similar to God of War, but it's just way faster. The circle button in this game allows you to use the Blessed Crucifix that shoots crucifixions from the palm of your hands. This is the shit they don't teach you in church. Doing a finisher on an enemy will also give you two options, punish or absolve. When punishing enemies, you gain XP for your unholy skill tree, while absolving enemies will give you XP for your holy skill tree. The unholy attacks can be performed by your square and triangle button, while the holy attack is performed by the circle button. I must say that I like both skill trees, as both contain very useful moves that are pretty cool and very useful. Also, unlike Heavenly Sword, most of these attacks are very distinctive from one another. You also have your magic attacks or special moves that are very bloody cool and extremely useful. I also have to highlight that this game has some awesome finishes, which was lacking in a lot of the God of War clones I played in this video. There are also enemies you can mount and control, and then use them to fight other enemies. And of course, the boss fights in this game are pretty darn cool. Now, I definitely think this could have been the greatest God of War clone out there if it wasn't for some of the issues this game has. First off, the enemy variety is very poor. This game definitely needed a little bit more enemies. The game early on throws these burning enemies at the player, and you have to then blast them with your holy attacks in order to douse the flames that will then allow you to kill them. This is pretty cool, but enemies like this were never really used the game, which I think is a waste of potential. I also do think that the enemies are damage sponges, as the regular enemies take a little bit too many hits to kill. The levels are similar to God of War in the sense that you are given a bunch of stuff that you can find that will give you a bunch of souls you can then use to unlock more moves. One of the coolest things you can find are these lost souls or something, I'm not quite sure what they're called, but like the enemies, you can either punish or absolve them. When you punish them, you will just get the souls. However, if you choose to absolve them, you'll be given a minigame, and depending on how well you do in this minigame, you'll get a bonus multiplier that will give you more souls. The levels also have some decent platforming sections as well, maybe not as good as Darksiders, but they are pretty decent. The environmental design of these levels are pretty cool as well. It is definitely not the most unique looking depiction of hell, but there are some neat touches like how there are demons that are doors, and Dante has to kill them to open these doors, which I thought was pretty awesome. Furthermore, the story was not that bad and pretty interesting at times, and Dante has some very cool and badass lines as well. Overall, Dante's Inferno in my opinion is pretty underrated. I had a lot of fun with this game, and even though there are some improvements that could have made this game way better, I think this game is worth playing. So many games today have clones, especially the very successful ones. The thing is that being a clone doesn't always mean it's just going to be a lesser version of the original game. A game like Darksiders perfectly demonstrates how to take inspiration from another game and put your own spin on things, while games like Dante's Inferno and Heavenly Sword shows you can make a one-to-one clone and still make a good game. So I think the overall conclusion of this video is that God of War is awesome, or something. Thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.